At 96, he did what everyone told him was impossible. That's how the story ends. But where it begins is in silence. His name was Walter Gresham, though most people had forgotten it long before he ever published a word. For decades, he lived in a quiet town tucked between gray hills and gray skies, the kind of place where nothing much changed, except the color of the leaves. Walter wasn't famous. He wasn't loud. He wasn't even particularly social. He was just there, an invisible presence in the back row of life. At 96, his back was curved like a question mark, and his hands shook with every motion. But there was something in his eyes that never trembled a quiet intensity, hidden under layers of time. He had spent his life as a clerk at a hardware store. 53 years of shelves, receipts, and rusted nails. He never complained, but also never spoke of dreams. No one knew what he did when he got home. The neighbors assumed he just fell asleep in front of the TV, like everyone else. But behind the heavy curtains of that old brick house, Walter kept a secret. He wrote, late into the night, under the flicker of a desk lamp, older than most of the town's children. He typed page after page, not emails, not blogs, not tweets, stories, long, aching, unfinished stories about love, loss, war, and longing. He kept them in boxes, dozens of them, all unpublished, all unread. His wife, Margaret, had once told him, "Someday, someone will read your words and feel seen." That was before she got sick, before the hospital visits, before the last letter he ever wrote, and never sent. After she passed, the house grew quieter than silence itself. Can you imagine that? Living an entire life filled with unspoken dreams, and then nothing. Just the weight of time and the sound of keys no one hears. Walter stopped writing for a while. Weeks turned into months. The typewriter stayed covered with a cloth, untouched like a grave for everything he once believed in. But grief is strange. It doesn't just break you. Sometimes it wakes you. One cold morning, as winter clung to the window panes, Walter stood up, walked to the old bookshelf, and pulled out a dusty box labeled Letters to M, inside 241 unsent letters to Margaret. Letters he wrote after she was gone. Pages filled with memories, regrets, small joys, and questions that would never be answered. He sat at his desk, removed the cloth, and for the first time in years, he began to type. To the one who still listens in my silence, Walter decided he would finish what he started, not just for Margaret, not for fame, but because some stories only find life in the final chapters of our own. He was 96. His hands hurt. His spine bent with time. But every word that came from that typewriter was a battle one. And that was just the beginning. He reorganized his old drafts, polished the words, cut what didn't matter, and kept only what was real. He stayed up past midnight, not because he had to, but because something inside him refused to sleep. The neighbors began to wonder, why was his light on every night? One day, a young volunteer from the library knocked on his door to deliver books. She saw the typewriter, the mountain of pages, the framed photo of a woman with the warmest smile. She said, "Are you writing something?" Walter nodded. He didn't explain. But something shifted after that. For the first time, he wanted someone to know, to read, to feel. He reached out to a small independent publisher. They didn't respond at first. He waited and waited. Then an email, a short one. Is this real? Walter sent the manuscript anyway. No agent, no cover letter, just a story, just truth. Weeks passed, then months, then a phone call. Mr. Gresham, I don't know what to say. Your book made me cry. We want to publish it. He couldn't believe it. Not because he thought it wasn't good, but because, after all these years, someone finally listened. Impossible? Not anymore. That winter, the book was released under the title The Letters I Never Sent. It didn't hit any bestseller list, but it found its way to widows, to dreamers, to the forgotten, to people who thought they were too late, too old, too invisible. One woman wrote, "Your story made me call my father after 12 years. Thank you." Walter never did any interviews. He never cared for fame. But the light in his study stayed on every night until the end. Because even when the world says it's over, some stories are just beginning. And if you think that's powerful, wait until you hear what happened on the day the book launched. The book's release was set for a quiet Tuesday morning. No fanfare, no autograph sessions, no media appearances. Just a small update on the publisher's website. Now available, The Letters I Never Sent by Walter Gresham. Walter woke up at 5:15 a.m., not out of excitement, but because he always did. The internal clock of a man who spent over 50 years opening a hardware store before dawn. But this morning, something was different. He didn't put on his usual gray cardigan. Instead, he reached for a dark blue velvet blazer that Margaret had bought him back in 1972, still wrapped in plastic, still smelling faintly of old wood and nostalgia. He sat at the kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of tea untouched beside him. Next to it lay the advance copy of his book, sent by the publisher a few days earlier. He ran his fingers slowly across the cover, as if touching a fragile relic. It was simple. A faded envelope, an old pen, and the title in modest but solid letters, The Letters I Never Sent at 9:02 a.m. The first reader comment appeared on the publisher's site. "I've only read 3 pages, and I'm already crying. Who is this man? Why haven't we heard of him before?" At 9:47, the publisher received an email. "Please forward this to the author. I lost my wife last year. I couldn't write about it." Until now, Walter saw none of it. He had no social media, no smartphone, no idea what a feed was. But he felt something in the air, a shift, as if the silence he had lived in for so long had just cracked open. That same week, a small literary blogger uploaded a video, The Book That Made Me Forgive My Mother. Within 24 hours, it had over 300,000 views. And suddenly, the name Walter Gresham started appearing in Facebook groups, forums, review threads, with lines like, "I couldn't stop reading." It felt like he was writing my story. It was like someone finally put my grief into words. People who had never met now felt deeply connected, all because of words typed by a 96-year-old man in a dusty study. The following week, the publisher received a call. It was the host of a podcast called The Forgotten Voices. They wanted to feature Walter's story. No interviews, just narration. Let the words speak. The publisher called him to ask. He paused for a moment and said, if it helps someone write their own story, then yes. The episode aired 2 days later. The host read aloud passages from the most emotional letters in the book. One, in particular, spread like fire. "If I could go back, I would have held you longer in silence. I would have watched you more while you were washing the dishes. I would have thanked you for every smile you gave me, even when I didn't deserve it. Now, I write to an empty space, but with the hope that you always heard me. Maybe you still do." Thousands of people began posting photos of themselves holding the book. Some were reading it next to the graves of loved ones. Others were sitting in quiet corners, writing their own letters for the first time. One recurring phrase emerged. "You never said it, but I knew." Walter watched all of this from his armchair, a newspaper resting on his lap. He didn't understand the full scope, but he felt something he hadn't in years. He was no longer invisible. One day, the young library volunteer returned. This time, she held a bundle of envelopes in her hands, letters, written by readers. Some were typed, others were written in cursive, with ink stains and tear marks. Walter opened each one slowly. There was no hurry. He read stories of loss, of reconnection, of long-buried memories. He read about fathers forgiven, children remembered, wives who never got a proper goodbye. Every line he read, he held like a breath that had been trapped for years. He had never asked for any of this. But now, it didn't feel like attention. It felt like connection. He wasn't just the writer anymore. He had become the voice of others who had never been heard. He didn't get rich. He didn't tour the world. No one handed him an award. But every evening at 6:30 p.m., Walter sat at his desk, turned on the lamp, and typed new letters, new memories, new beginnings for Margaret, for the strangers, for those who still thought it was too late. And then, one quiet Sunday evening, he typed the last line of a new story. What you never said can still be heard. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it arrived tucked between electricity bills and grocery store ads. A plain white envelope. No return address, just his name, Walter Gresham, typed in an old-fashioned font like something from decades ago. He almost tossed it aside, but something about it felt different. He ran a trembling finger under the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times. The handwriting was delicate, but firm, not rushed, not afraid. Dear Walter, I don't know if you'll read this. I'm not even sure you're real, but your words reached me when no one else could. And now I need to tell you something. Walter read it once, then again, and again. Each line felt like a mirror, not of his own story, but of what his story had awakened in someone else. The letter came from a man named Samuel, aged 67, a former schoolteacher who had stopped speaking to his daughter 15 years earlier, over a fight. He couldn't even remember the details, but the silence had grown roots. Pride hardened. Time passed. He read the letters I never sent after seeing it in a bookstore he never planned to enter. He read it in one sitting, then sat in his car and cried not because of what Walter had lost, but because of what he still could regain. I went home, Walter. I picked up the phone. I called her. I didn't know what I'd say. I just said I missed her. She didn't hang up. She cried. So did I. Walter folded the letter slowly, held it to his chest, closed his eyes. In that moment, in the dim quiet of his study, he wasn't just a writer anymore. He was part of something larger. His words hadn't just gone out into the world, they had returned, carrying healing in their wake. Imagine this. You live nearly a century. You watch love fade, friends disappear, health decline. You feel forgotten, irrelevant, invisible. And then one sentence you wrote reaches into someone else's silence and cracks it open. The publisher contacted Walter the next day. Dozens more letters had come in, not reviews, not praise, stories. Raw, human, unfinished stories from strangers who suddenly felt seen. There was the woman who forgave her sister after 20 years. The man who wrote to the son he abandoned. The nurse who finally opened her late husband's journals. Each of them said the same thing. In different ways, your story gave me permission to speak again. Walter wasn't chasing a legacy, but he was living one. Every word he'd once kept hidden in boxes was now being carried not on bestseller lists, but in the pockets of people who'd almost given up on their own chapters. He began writing back, not with advice, not as a guru, but as a friend. Each response was short. Thank you for your courage. I'm glad you called her. It's never too late to write back. He received a second letter from Samuel a few weeks later. We had coffee yesterday, Walter. She brought pictures of my grandson. He's 7. I had never met him. Walter's eyes filled with tears. Not the kind that fall, the kind that stay warm and full like the ones you hold when you feel both broken and whole. That night, he didn't write. He sat by the window instead, watched the sky turn from orange to indigo, watched as the world quietly went on, but somehow felt different, as if all the years he thought were lost had simply been waiting for the right moment to bloom. In the silence, Margaret's voice returned, not as a ghost, not as memory, as presence. "I told you, Walt, someday someone would feel seen." The library smelled like polished oak and time. It was the same library where Walter had spent countless afternoons as a young man. Back when Margaret still met him after work. Back when letters were still handwritten and silence still had depth. He hadn't stepped inside for nearly 2 decades. But now he was back not as a visitor, not as a forgotten old man looking for warmth, but as an author. The invitation came in a handwritten note from the same young volunteer who once helped him scan his manuscript. Her name was Elena, and she had read the letters I never sent 4 times. "We're doing a small reading session," the note said. "People need to hear your words and your voice." Even just once, Walter hesitated. He hadn't read aloud in front of people since he read his vows to Margaret in a trembling voice that cracked on the word forever. But something in him stirred, a quiet echo, a soft urge not to disappear again. He agreed. The event wasn't publicized. Just a small poster near the front desk. An afternoon with Walter Gresham, author, reading no date of birth. No fanfare, just a name and the quiet promise of presence. That Sunday, Walter arrived 15 minutes early. Elena met him at the entrance. She wore a navy blue scarf and carried a clipboard she didn't really need. "You look nervous," she smiled. "I'm terrified," he replied with a half laugh. They walked together past the rows of shelves to a small reading room tucked in the back. There were 12 chairs, all filled. Walter sat at the head of the small circle. He adjusted his reading glasses, opened a worn copy of the book. His hands shook, just slightly, but enough that he had to take a deep breath before beginning. "To the one I never dared write to, you haunt me. Not like a ghost, but like a perfume I can't forget. I see you in coffee cups, in rain on windows, in songs that never finish playing." There was no cough, no whisper, no phone ringing, just breath and tears. One woman held her hands over her mouth. A man with silver hair clenched the arm of his chair. They weren't just listening to a story. They were meeting themselves again. In his pauses, in his tremors, in the words he hadn't spoken in decades. Walter stopped after 6 pages, not because he couldn't continue, but because he felt he didn't need to. The silence that followed was full, not empty. He looked up, and for the first time since Margaret passed, he saw something in the eyes of others that mirrored his own interior world. Recognition. After a long pause, a woman in her 60s raised her hand. Did she ever know? She asked. "Margaret, did she know you were writing to her all that time?" Walter looked down at the book, then back up. "I think she always knew, but I didn't write for her to know. I wrote because I couldn't keep carrying the weight of silence." A man spoke next. He had brought a notebook. "I started writing letters to my father again," he said. "He's gone. But something about this book, it gave me permission." Walter didn't respond right away. He just nodded, like a candle flickering in gratitude. Elena brought tea and placed it quietly on the small table beside him. "Would you read one more?" she whispered. Walter flipped through the pages, stopped on one near the end, the letter with the trembling ink and the most crossed-out words. "I once believed that age erased desire, not romantic desire, but the desire to be heard. I was wrong. You don't get too old to need connection. You just get too tired to ask for it." He didn't finish the page. He didn't need to. Someone in the back sobbed softly. Someone else placed a hand on the stranger next to them. And in that moment, 12 strangers were no longer strangers. When the reading ended, they didn't applaud. They just sat with it. The librarian didn't rush them. The clock didn't matter. Walter stood slowly. He folded his glasses, placed the book back into the leather bag he always carried. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. Elena walked him out into the cold evening air. The sky was a soft gray, fading into indigo. "You were brilliant," she said. Walter smiled faintly. "I was honest. That's all I ever wanted to be." He walked home alone. Each step felt lighter, not because the years had fallen away, but because the silence had. Inside his house, he turned on the lamp, opened the desk drawer, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began a new letter. "To the person I haven't met yet, if you find these words, know that they came from everything I could no longer hold inside. And maybe, just maybe, they'll help you release something too." Walter didn't expect to return to Margaret's grave. He had said his goodbye, the final kind, more than a decade ago. But something in him shifted after the library reading. Not just the way people responded, but the way he had responded. It wasn't grief that called him back. It was something quieter. Something that sounded like closure, but felt more like permission. The morning was overcast, the kind of light that makes shadows soft. Walter walked slowly, hands deep in his coat pockets. He carried no flowers, no photos, no tokens. Only a folded letter, written on the same type of paper he used when he wrote to her every day but never mailed. He hadn't visited in 8 years. The headstone was simple. Margaret Elaine Gresham, 1931-2009, still listening. Walter smiled when he read the last line. He'd chosen it, back when the law still throbbed instead of pulsed. Still listening. He used to wonder if it was true. Today, he didn't need proof. He sat on the bench beside her grave. The wind was barely moving. Only the leaves knew it was there. He unfolded the letter and read aloud. "Dear Margaret, for years, I wrote to you and no one else. Not because I believed you'd answer, but because no one else could listen the way you used to. But something has happened, love. I finally mailed the letter. Not to you, not to heaven. To everyone?" They listened. They wrote back. "A man met his grandson for the first time because of a sentence I wrote. A daughter forgave her mother. A nurse opened her husband's journal and found herself again." He paused. The wind sighed once through the trees. A squirrel darted across the path. "I didn't think it mattered anymore. Not the stories, not my voice, not me. But it did. You were right." His voice trembled. "You always said I held too much inside. You said that one day I'd be brave enough to put it all on paper. I wasn't brave. I was desperate." He folded the letter, tucked it under the edge of the headstone. The wind didn't take it. It stayed, just like her. Walter leaned back on the bench. His eyes weren't wet. They were full the way a well is full, even when it looks still. He thought of her laugh, of the way she used to tilt her head when she knew he was lying, of how she never once asked him to publish a word. "You have to want to be heard," she had once said. "But first, you have to want to speak." It was time to go, but not because he was done, because he was ready. He stood, placed 2 fingers against the headstone, and whispered, "I sent the letters, Margaret." And they wrote back. The walk home was different. He noticed the cracks in the sidewalk, the sound of wind chimes 2 blocks away, the smell of cinnamon from the bakery he thought had closed years ago. He was alive, not just breathing alive. That night, he didn't write. He sat by the fireplace, held a book he had already read, listened to music with no lyrics, and smiled, because for the first time in years, He wasn't writing to fill the silence. He was letting the silence speak. It was a quiet evening. No ticking clock, no radio hum. Just the crackle of the fire and the steady breath of an old man writing to someone he once was. Walter sat at his desk, pen in hand, paper in place. But this wasn't another letter to Margaret. Not this time. This letter was for someone else, someone he had forgotten, ignored, and at times resented. It was for himself. The decision came earlier that afternoon, after he received an unexpected email from a reader. The subject line read, "I wish I could talk to my younger self too." She was 62, divorced, alone, starting her life over in a one-bedroom apartment after 30 years of marriage. She wrote, "I keep asking, how did I let it go so long?" Walter stared at that sentence for a long time, because he had asked the same thing for decades. And now, maybe, finally, he had something to say in return. He began with hesitation, "Dear Walter," then paused. The younger version of him was not someone easy to reach. That man was proud, afraid of emotion, terrified of failure, and worst of all, convinced that time was endless. But Walter had learned the hardest way. He kept writing, "You're not weak. You're scared, and that's different. Scared of speaking too loudly, of feeling too deeply, of wanting too much. But let me tell you something, your silence won't protect you. It will become your prison." The fire shifted slightly in the grate. He could almost see his younger self, dark hair, jaw tense, dreams clutched too tightly. A man who never cried at funerals but wept quietly after reading a love letter he never sent. "I know you think you have time. Time to fix it, time to say it, time to be brave. But here's the truth. You don't have time. You only have choices." Walter stopped to take a sip of tea. The paper already had smudges where his hand had rested too long. But he kept writing. Write the book. Even if no one reads it, say you're sorry. Even if you think it won't matter, love her like it's the last day, because one day it will be. He stared at that last line. It hurt. It always did. But he had stopped avoiding pain. Now he listened to it, because pain, if you let it speak, becomes something else. Sometimes it becomes a guide. He continued, "You will lose her, and it will break you. But from that fracture, something remarkable will grow." He glanced at the window. It had started to snow. A kind of snow that didn't pile, just dusted everything with stillness. Like forgiveness. One day, you will be 96. You won't recognize your own hands. You will walk slower, speak softer, and feel everything more. But you will write, and the world will hear you. And in that voice, you'll meet yourself again. Walter's hand trembled as he reached the final lines. Not from weakness, from release. "I forgive you. Not because you asked, but because you tried. That's enough." That was always enough. He signed it simply Walter, no dates. No explanation. He folded the letter and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept the others. Letters to Margaret. Letters never mailed. Letters filled with truths too heavy for speaking. This one, though, was different. This one had lifted something. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and felt, perhaps for the first time since she died, peace. It came on a Wednesday. Gray sky, no wind, just the sound of the postman's slow footsteps and the soft click of the mailbox. Walter wasn't expecting anything. He hadn't ordered new ink. No bills were due. No holidays coming. But when he opened the mailbox, there it was. A small envelope, cream-colored. No return address. Just his name, written in handwriting that felt careful. Mr. Walter Gresham. Inside was a letter. No email, no typed lines. Just a simple note in blue ink. "Dear Mr. Gresham, my name is Evan. I'm 19. I read your book last month, and it felt like someone finally said what I've been thinking my whole life. I've never written to an author before, but your story changed something in me. I'm not good with words. I don't know what to say, but I'd like to meet you, even for 5 minutes. If you're willing, I'll be at the Rosebridge Library this Saturday, 3 p.m. Same room where your first reading happened. I'll bring the coffee. There was no phone number, no email, just the quiet confidence of someone who believed he might be heard. Walter held the letter in his hands longer than he needed to. He stared at the name Evan and wondered what it must have cost a 19-year-old to write something that honest. He didn't answer right away. He placed the letter on his desk, beside the others. But that night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd written a book, not a map. But this young man was treating it like one. By Saturday, Walter had made his decision. He put on his old coat, wrote a single line on a small card, and left the house. The walk to the library was slow. He paused twice, once for breath, once for memory. The building hadn't changed. The same ivy crawled up the east wall, the same mural on the glass doors, the same creak in the floorboards as he walked in. Room 3B was empty. Except for him. Evan sat near the back, curly hair, worn shoes, nervous eyes. In his hands, he clutched a paperback copy of Still Listening Walter's book. The cover was bent, the pages marked with sticky notes. Walter smiled. Something warm bloomed behind his ribs. Evan stood when he saw him. Amar? Gresham? Walter nodded, held out his hand. Just Walter. They shook hands. No cameras. No social media posts. Just two human beings separated by almost 8 decades, connected by paper and ink. They sat by the window. Evan handed him a cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. Didn't know how you took it, Evan said. You got it right, Walter replied. There was silence, but not the awkward kind. The kind that makes room for something real. I didn't think you'd come, Evan finally said. I almost didn't, Walter admitted. But your letter reminded me of myself. Long ago, Evan looked down. I don't talk much. People think I'm weird. But when I read your book, it felt like home. Walter nodded slowly. Then we have something in common. They talked for nearly 2 hours. About books, about fear, about feeling invisible in different ways. Walter didn't offer advice. He didn't play the wise old man. He just listened, the way Margaret used to listen to him. At one point, Evan pulled out a notebook. He showed Walter something scribbled in pencil. Rough lines. Half sentences. It's, I don't know, maybe a story? Walter read it, then looked up. Don't throw this away, he said. It's not perfect, but it's true. And that's harder to find than good grammar. Evan smiled, a real smile, not the nervous kind. When the sky started to darken, Walter stood. He reached into his coat and handed Evan the small card. One line, handwritten. Your voice matters. Use it. No name. No signature. Just a sentence that had taken him a lifetime to believe. As they parted ways, Evan said, "Thank you, Walter. For everything, I'll write it. I promise." Walter nodded. "I know you will." That night, Walter didn't write. He didn't need to. He had spoken his words into someone else's hands. And for once, that was enough. 3 weeks had passed. The leaves had begun to shift crisp yellows, replacing tired greens. Walter had returned to his quiet life. Morning tea, afternoon walks, a few letters, a few dreams. And then, one Saturday morning, there was a knock on the door. 3 taps, not hurried, not hesitant. He opened it slowly. There stood Evan, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind Evan stood a woman, mid-50s, graceful but weathered. She wore a long, faded cardigan. In her hand, a folded copy of Still Listening, marked with tabs and notes. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear. With something else, something Walter recognized, recognition of pain, of truth, of being seen. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Evan said quickly, "but she's the one who gave me your book. She said she needed to meet you." The woman stepped forward. "Mr. Gresham," she said softly, "your words brought back someone I thought I had lost." Walter motioned them inside. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Some visits don't need context, just courage. They sat in the sunroom. The old wooden chairs creaked with memory. Evan didn't speak much. He watched the way his mentor, now his friend, leaned forward, shoulders open, eyes kind. The woman began to share. Her name was Helen. She had lost her husband 2 years ago, not to death, but to silence. He had stopped speaking after their son passed, stopped working, stopped hoping. One day, she left a copy of Walter's book on the kitchen table, highlighted her favorite passage, and went out for groceries. When she returned, her husband was crying, not broken, but cracked open. He didn't say anything, she continued, but the next morning, he made coffee, and he said he wanted to start again. Walter didn't speak. His throat felt full, not with sadness, with something softer. Gratitude, perhaps, or humility. "I've read your book 4 times now," Helen added, "not because I need answers, but because your pain gave me permission to feel mine." That was the sentence, the one that made Walter set down his teacup. Permission. That's what all of this had been about. Not fame, not forgiveness, but permission to grieve, to speak, to hope again. Evan pulled something from his backpack. It was a printed email. He handed it to Walter. "It's from my professor," Evan explained. "She read a short story. I submitted something I never would have written if not for you. She asked me to consider submitting it to a journal." Walter scanned the page. It wasn't long, but it was filled with praise, encouragement, a seed just beginning to sprout. "You started something," Evan said quietly, "and I think it's spreading." Walter looked at them, both a grieving widow and a nervous writer, and saw something he hadn't seen in years' impact. Not loud, not grand, but real. They stayed for lunch. Helen brought sandwiches. Evan made tea. They laughed, once awkward and brief, but beautiful. Before they left, Walter asked if he could give them something. He walked to his study, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out 2 envelopes. Inside were 2 copies of a letter, the one he had written to his younger self. He handed one to Evan and one to Helen. "Read it when you need to remember who you are," he said, "or who you were before the world told you to be quieter." Helen hugged him, tightly, without hesitation. Evan followed. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to. After they left, Walter returned to the sunroom. He sat down, watched the wind move through the trees, and let the stillness hold him. That night, he wrote nothing, but he left the front porch light on, just in case someone else decided to knock. The house was quiet, even quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that settles after something ends, or just before something begins again. Walter sat at his desk, hands resting gently on the wood that had supported decades of silence, and now years of release. There was one last page in his journal, one final space. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate either. He simply picked up the pen and began. "To the one who will read this last, you might be a stranger, or someone who thinks they know me. You might be young, or old, or somewhere in between. But if you found these words, then maybe they're yours too." He paused, The fire was low in the corner, his tea untouched, but his heart was clear. Most of my life, I was afraid of being seen, not just by others, but by myself. I thought if I kept quiet, nothing could hurt me. But silence doesn't protect. It isolates. Walter leaned back, gazing at the small photo on the wall. Margaret, smiling like she always did, like she knew secrets and didn't need to share them. If I could tell my younger self one thing, it would be this: you are allowed to speak, even if your voice shakes, even if it's messy, even if no one listens. The wind tapped gently against the window. Like a knock from the past, he smiled. I spent years loving someone in silence, then years grieving them in silence. Now, I've spent these last moments sharing in full voice, and somehow that has brought her back to me. Not in body, but in light, in memory, in every reader who whispered, "Me too." His hands didn't shake anymore. His words flowed without resistance. They weren't perfect. They were honest. If you are holding on to a story, don't let it go. Set it down. Give it breath, because the world is starving for truth, and you have some inside you. He closed the journal. No dramatic sigh, no music swelling in the background. Just silence, but it was a full silence, not empty. That evening, Walter walked slowly to the mailbox. No letters today. Instead, he slipped something into it. An envelope, unmarked, unsealed. Inside was a copy of that final letter, folded with care. He left it there. Someone would find it. The next morning, a teenager passing by on his bike stopped at the mailbox. Curious, bored, he pulled out the envelope. Read the letter. He didn't understand all of it, but one line stuck. Let it go. Set it down. Give it breath. He folded it again, put it in his pocket, and when he got home, he started writing something. Back at the house, Walter sat on the porch, eyes closed. The wind moved through the trees, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel alone. Autumn turned to winter, and with it, the days became shorter, but strangely, not colder. Walter no longer feared the silence. It had become something sacred, a space where he could hear the past without drowning in it. Each morning, he sat by the window with his tea, watching the light stretch across the trees, knowing that someone, somewhere, was holding his words in their hands. The letter had traveled, passed from hand to hand, left on park benches, tucked into library books, shared through whispers, screenshots, and midnight conversations. Walter had become a name people said softly, not with fame, but with familiarity. One afternoon, a local journalist knocked on his door. She had tears in her eyes. "Your story saved my sister," she said. "She's writing again." Walter didn't ask for details. He just nodded and offered her a seat. Another evening, a young mother came by, holding a baby in one arm and his book in the other. "When I thought I couldn't raise him alone, I read your chapter on loss, and I decided to stay." Walter held the baby for a moment. The child stared at him, wide-eyed, then smiled. He hadn't held life like that in years. One by one, his story began to return to him, not in royalties, not in reviews, but in the ripple effect of courage, the quiet rebellion of people choosing to begin again. Walter returned to room 3B one final time. The library had set up a plaque outside. This room once held a man who reminded the world that it is never too late to speak, to heal, to live again. He didn't cry. He just stood there, hand resting against the doorframe, heart heavy with gratitude. Inside, he found a stack of letters. Readers, strangers, dreamers. All of them thanking him, not for being perfect, but for being honest. He sat down in the same chair from his first reading. It creaked like before. He looked out the window at the trees now bare but standing strong, and whispered to no one, "Thank you, Margaret, for waiting long enough for me to find my voice." That night, Walter wrote one final note, not for publication, not for anyone in particular. He placed it on his desk. "If you're reading this, it means the story reached you too. I hope you remember this one truth: you are not too late." He passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later. No pain, no fanfare, just stillness. But the story didn't end there. Evan published his first book the following year. The dedication read for Walter Gresham, who taught me that silence isn't strength. Voices. Helen started a grief group for widows who didn't know how to cry anymore. They met every Sunday and read passages from Still Listening Aloud. A teenager who found Walter's letter in the mailbox became a therapist. He kept the copy in his office drawer next to a photo of a man he never met. The ripple never stopped. It moved outward, quietly, boldly, forever. And if you're still here, still listening, then maybe this story was meant for you too. Not because you're broken, but because you're becoming. So, if there's a part of you that's been waiting for a sign, a reason to start, to forgive, to speak, let this be it. This is your moment. This is your invitation to begin again. If Walter's story touched something in you, stay with us. There are more voices, more echoes, more stories that remind us it's never too late. Subscribe to the channel to walk this journey with us. You don't have to do it alone.